Welcome to the program today. Mondo Gonzalez here in studio, and we have through Skype Graham Keelan, who is historian, theologian from England. And we've been participating or really bringing out a study on the nation of Israel. Not just the nation of Israel as we see the modern state, but the whole theology of Israel going all the way back to Abraham and the significance that we have for how should we look at Israel today through a biblical lens, even a cultural lens, a historical lens. And so we want to continue that study. Before we do, I want to remind everybody that we have a conference coming up at the end of February, March 1st, right around that weekend, OrlandoProphecySummit.com. We invite all of you to go over there and check it out and to join us in Orlando. What a great time of the year to be there in sunny Florida. We're going to have over 24 speakers joining us. Again, all of your favorites coming and sharing the word, as well as all the things that are happening right now as we watch prophecy really just unfold every single day. Certainly we'll have an update on all the things that are happening in the land of Israel as it relates to the war and some of the things that we're watching and some of the potential things that are happening. Could this be Psalm 83, Isaiah 17, or even Ezekiel 38? What are all these things happening? How does Israel stand strong in the coming months and even years as it relates to a buildup of the hatred and the anti-Semitism that's coming around? So again, join us in Orlando, OrlandoProphecySummit.com. Hope to see you there. It'll be a great time. Well, right now, Graham, welcome from all the way from England.
Thank you very much, Mondo. Session 3. Let's join you.
Yep, session 3. And in the first couple sessions, for those if you've missed it, you can check our our channel, YouTube channel, of course, and to see that we introduced really the history of Israel. We talked about that God calls it my land. It's not even Israel's land per se, it's God's land. God is a real estate broker. We see 8 times in the Bible he says my land, my land, my land, but he's given it to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We also saw, again, the history of that theologically, biblically, coming up to really the first century and the rejection. We talked a lot last time about the rejection of Jesus and their dispersion into the world, and even covering Jerusalem being labeled several times in the Old Testament as a bloody city and a city of vengeance. And what we want to do in this session is we want to even step back for a moment. We don't want to leave the first century. We don't want to leave the historical period where Jesus comes and God sends his son to be a witness to Israel and all the things that he did, and that this wasn't just an afterthought, that this was the culmination of God's prophetic ministry through the prophets and other things, as we see in Hebrews chapter 1. He's spoken in many ways, visions, dreams, in times past, but has finally spoken through his son. But what we want to dwell on is was Jesus, who is Jesus as a witness to Israel, and what was he a witness to? What were the culmination of the promises that God gave? And also, as we end today's really discussion, we want to talk about what that means for the first century. What did Paul think about the rejection of Jesus as a witness, and also the historical ramifications all the way to our present age. So Graham, here we are. We see Jesus as the Son. We talked a lot about the parable that God having Israel as a vineyard, and he sent different prophets, and he says, but if I send my son, they'll listen to him. And we saw the rejection there. Let's kind of just jump right into it about Jesus being that culmination of Old Testament prophecy and really the grand theme of being a witness to Israel.
Yeah, so this is a big topic, right? What we're talking about. So, and what we're going to talk about tonight is there's a lot of theological depth to it. So we need to just take some points out to where people can maybe go and study themselves, and then, but hopefully just create a bit of a picture, or a tapestry to continue the narrative. So, yeah, what you said there, we discussed about Jesus as the Son. And tonight we're going to look at Jesus as the witness, and it's a special designation, particularly in the Psalms. I've been trying to get to Psalm 89 for the last 2 sessions, and that you know, that thing where God doesn't leave himself without witness, right? Well, Jesus is the actual ultimate witness. Now, when we go back, remember the first session that we spoke about, we spoke about the land, and then that the land belongs to God, as you said, and he apportions that piece of land out for himself, for a people he's going to separate to himself. So the land separated to him, and the people are going to be separated to him. And through this land and through this people, he is going to work effectively salvation for the world. So, and the first instance there we see actually in the in that land. So it becomes a land of witness. We have the witness and we have the land of witness. So the first point there we see in the Genesis narrative actually about the witness in the land is the king priest Melchizedek. So, you know, I mean, the land is full of these Canaanite tribes, full of hybrid races, quite possibly, or the beginning of these things, you know, and we have there this strange individual, much discussed, much disagreed about, Melchizedek. Who was he? But that's for another time. But what we do know is he is the priest of El Elyon, and he's the Most High God, and he is the one who Abraham literally receives the blessings from. So he is the intermediary who blesses Abraham, and so it says that he is the king of Salem, and it's the same city. The Melchizedek city is the same city that David would later capture as the capital. So this city's already been pinpointed to be God's witness city in the earth. I mean, that's really important. So something is going to happen with this narrative then, where Jerusalem becomes the witness city, which is why Jerusalem it's witness to God's goodness, his righteousness, and his grace and his mercy, but it's also witness to his wrath. Right, and he denounces the city, and he builds his house there, and then he'll let his house be destroyed. In other words, he'll let his witness be destroyed because of what they're doing in the land. So this is kind of then the backdrop where we can pick up the story 1,000 years later. That, you know, after more or less about 1,000 after the time of Abraham. And then we've got here 2 Chronicles 6:6. We'll just read some scriptures. Since that day that I brought my people out of the land of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. And I chose no man as prince over my people Israel, but I've chosen Jerusalem, that my name may be there, and I've chosen David to be over my people Israel. So don't forget, when Melchizedek was there was no people of Israel, right? It was just Abraham. So it's the beginning of this journey for this city, which bears God's name, which bears God's priest. And kingship. And of course, we know that David is effectively made a king after the order of Melchizedek. It's that kind of king priesthood that he has, and of course, Jesus fulfills that entirely. So we got here another one. Plenty of scriptures, 2 Kings 21:7, 2 Chronicles 7:16. People can look them up. The Lord said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I've chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. So he's not chosen any other city in that nation where he will put his name other than Jerusalem. So, you know, Jerusalem becomes the focal point then of prophetic history for Israel and for the nations. So we got to see this play out. So nothing changes here. You know, God hasn't. He may have dealt with Jerusalem in a very severe way, as Paul says. He's dealt with him severely, but he hasn't removed his promise about the city and about the throne of David. So again, let's in 2 Samuel chapter 7:14. He says to David, "I took you from the sheep." And he says, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel. I will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more, as formerly from that time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. Then he says here in verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, and you shall come, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever, and I will be to him a father. These are important phrases. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. If you know the New Testament, all this should be ringing now in your heads about who ultimately is going to fulfill this. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, he shall be to my son. When he commits iniquity, now this is not talking about Jesus, obviously, this is just the general sons of David. I will discipline him with a rod. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house, David, and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So it's all this forever language, Mondo. It's this is not like God changing his mind. God has to do things differently because his people and his city reject him. So, we have that with Jesus, right? Why, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stone the prophets and kill those who sent to you, how often I would long to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not be gathered. So again, a messianic mandate. So what we want to look at here quickly is Psalm 89. And it speaks of this particular individual called the witness. And he's described here as the faithful witness. And his place is actually in the skies. So just to pick up a few verses, we won't go through the whole psalm, but people can read it. It says, I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With my mouth I'll make known your faithfulness to all generations. So here's the faithfulness of the Lord. For I said steadfast love will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness. You have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David my servant. I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. It's the same sort of language that we got in Samuel, we get in Chronicles. Then there's something interesting here in verse 5. It says, let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? Now, just to mention a technical thing here, Mondo, is that Hebrew poetry, this is what the psalm is different from English poetry, right? So English poetry is rhyme and rhythm. Hebrew poetry is parallelism, effectively. And that means sometimes one line will correspond with another line, or the first line will correspond with the third line, or the first line will correspond with the fourth line, and the two lines in between correspond with each other. So this is what's happening here. And I just want to point this out because we'll get to another place which is important. So it says here, let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord. And that's God's personal name. Now, some people think Yahweh. I prefer, I think it is Jehovah, but it doesn't matter. That's his personal name. I let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? So the faithfulness in the assembly, the assembly of the holy ones now is the same as who in the skies could be compared to the Lord. Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord, a God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones and awesome above all who are around him. So he's talking then about this, about the faithfulness of God in the skies, in the assembly of the holy ones. A bit of a divine council thing going on here, and that no one in the skies, these heavenly beings, can be compared to the Lord, because he is just greatly to be feared, even in the council of the holy ones in the skies, right? So he goes on to say about who this Holy One is, God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, your faithfulness all around. And this is what this psalm is all about. It's all about the faithfulness of the one who is in the skies, and he's faithful to the throne of David. So to establish it. Yeah, go ahead.
So let me jump in for a second, because I think where you're going now is powerful. But let's I want to rehearse this for those listening, watching, in that this is important, because what we see in Psalm 89 is we don't often see this in the sense that we don't always have this in our mind, in that there is a witness. There's a witness of the innumerable amount of angels that are watching the salvation plan of God. And we see this all through the history. Many of the patriarchs, they're building altars. We see when Moses comes in, and especially in Deuteronomy 30, 29 and 30, he says, I call heaven and earth as a witness against you today. And so you have the angels, I would say in many ways, all the spiritual beings, which is what you see in Psalm 89, the council of the holy ones. You see them watching God's interaction with these people down on earth, these rebellious people, which means all of humanity. So Moses, in his actions, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, is recounting all God's faithfulness. And he says, listen, I'm calling on heaven as a witness against you, because you're going to go in, and he personifies the land. The land, if you go in and you're not obedient, the land will vomit you out. He uses all this language. Even when Joshua comes across and they're crossing the Jordan River, he sets up the stones inside the river, the dry riverbed, as a witness. So we have this language all through the Old Testament is the rocks are going to be a witness, the angels are going to be a witness, the heavens are going to be a witness. And so because their obedience or their lack thereof, and again, we know that if they do well, God says, I will bless you. You'll have rain, you'll have all these things. But if you don't, I'm going to kick you out of my land. And so what we're going to see here in Psalm 89 and continue is that, again, the writer is calling on the heavenly witness and the heavenly beings to stand as a witness. But let's bring it you said it there. God's faithfulness is to his covenants, his land, but also to Jerusalem specifically. And now we're getting into 2 Samuel 7, the covenant that he made to David. And this comes up in Psalm 89 that let's bring it right in now. This covenant of David, why is it significant? And talk about the witness of what we have to that.
Okay, so, then you get to verse 20, and he says, I've chosen one among the people. I found David my servant. With my holy oil I've anointed him. My hand shall be established with him. And basically what this psalm is speaking about now is because the Jews actually understood that, because this is a very messianic psalm. It speaks of David, but it speaks as someone who's more than David, a greater than David. And we just see that in the language itself, because it says here, the enemy shall not outwit him, the wicked shall not humble him. Well, David was outwitted at times. I will crush his foes before him and strike down those who hate him. My faithfulness and my steadfast love shall be with him, and in my name shall his horn be exalted. Then he talks about, I will set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. This is very messianic. Mm-hmm. And he shall cry to me, again, that language, you are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. And look at this again, I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Well, David never assumed that role as the highest of the kings of the earth. So it's speaking of someone different, but somehow connected with the house of David. My steadfast love I will keep for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him. I will establish his offspring forever, and his throne as the days of the heavens. So there you go. He's going to establish David's offspring forever, and the throne of David and his offspring as the days of heaven. Okay, and then what he does, Mondo, he comes down. It will come down here right to the end, and this is what I want to get to here. So he says, I will not remove from him this David person. I will not remove from him my steadfast love or be false to my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His offspring shall endure forever. His throne as the sun before me, like the moon it shall be established forever, a faithful witness in the skies. And this is why I brought up at the beginning. So we have some parallelism here. So if people, when you read this, you want to read A-B-B-A, all right? Abba, Father, there you go. So his offspring, there's a swearing here to David that he.
We're in we're in Psalm 89, verse 36.
Verse 36.
So if people want to follow along, Psalm 89, 36, and 37, you'll see these 4 lines. Go ahead.
Yeah. So his offspring shall endure forever. David's offspring. Then it says his throne. So that's one line. His throne, as long as the sun before me. So now we're talking about David's throne. or the offspring's throne. Like the moon, it shall be established forever. So those two lines go together, right? So his throne as long as the sun, and like the moon, it shall be established forever. You know, that's what it's talking about. And then the final line there, it talks about the faithful witness in the skies, which is back to the first line. So you could read it this way: his offspring shall endure forever, a faithful witness in the skies. So this is what now Jesus begins to allude to when he says, you know, I've come down from heaven. No man has been to heaven, but I have come down from heaven. Jesus is pulling on all of this sort of language in the Old Testament, and which is why, you know, he asked the Pharisees, the scribes, he said, whose son is whose son is the Messiah? Who's the son of David? Well, why does then David call him Lord? Mm-hmm. And they couldn't answer him. So they had in their minds anyway this son of David figure who was actually greater than David, because David himself called him Lord. And it's that idea then that we want to really touch on in this session about this witness then that comes to Israel. Now, in the Old Testament, he's come down, in various times. He came down with Abraham, with two of the angels. He's come down to witness against the nations, at Babel, at Sodom. He's in the burning bush. He's on Mount Sinai. He's in the pillar of cloud and fire. He appears in the tabernacle. In the cloud with Moses, and he's known in the Old Testament also as the angel of the Lord, right? But now what happens with this witness in the skies? Now, what's he witnessing to? He's witnessing to the promises to the throne and the house of David especially, which is there in Jerusalem. And so what happens now? The witness comes down, he incarnates himself, you know, as one of them. He lives in the midst of them. He's born King of the Jews. He's a son of Abraham. He's a son of David. He's conceived in the womb of Mary. He's circumcised the 8th day, right? So this witness in the skies now has come down, and he comes as the witness for Israel, to Israel, and eventually it would be against Israel, because Israel rejects him. So at the age of 12, he's in the temple already, isn't he? He's already in the temple, and he's bearing witness. I mean, he's a teenager. He's not even a teenager. He's bearing witness in his father's house, and then he comes to Israel later on, 18 years later, with signs and wonders and miracles. Right? He's coming down to declare who he is. That God's promise to Israel has not been abrogated, or his covenant to David, right? So this is what we're talking about here, about this witness. And in the end, of course, they refused him. They refused the witness, that he was the witness, even though he had told them that the works that I do, it's the Father do those works in me. I'm not doing them of my own strength. And so this is where now the clash point for the city now. It's crunch time for the Jews and for the city, because now, go ahead.
You know, well, I like where you're going, because and before we go there, just want to remind everybody that what you said needs to be reiterated, and that is, especially if you read the Gospel of John, over and over and over, Jesus would make these comments that no one has come down, John 3:15, no one has come down from heaven except the Son of Man. You know, having this language, I've come down from my Father, you don't receive my witness. And then all through John 6, 7, and 8, you have this dialogue, and they accuse him of being a witness for himself. And he says, no, even if I did bear witness of myself, it would be true, but my Father bears witness of me through the works, and there's others. But then all through the Gospel of John, it's the only gospel where he says, I'm leaving, I'm going away, I'm going back up, and where I'm going you can't follow. Even to the disciples, he goes, you know, where I'm going you can't follow yet, you will afterwards. But it's very unique in the Gospel of John, this connection that he makes about this Psalm 89 heavenly witness coming down from the skies. I mean, that had to be really strange. And we see the interaction with the Pharisees. They didn't understand it, or they rejected it, or whatever. I think that they understood the ramifications, as you mentioned in Matthew 22, where he's quoting Psalm 110, David, who's the son of David if he calls him my Lord? They understood it. I think they were just being stubborn and recognizing. But we have the connection between his person, his ministry, but now the city. Let's talk about the city.
Yeah. So now the city is the witness on earth, and the city which. That's God left the city on earth to be his witness, and so now when the witness comes to the city of witness, and then the city of witness rejects him, there's now no other course of action than what Jesus then pronounces upon them, right? So he says. I have to back up what you were saying. Is that this is it, Mondo? We read these statements and we think, oh, well, that's just a very poetic way of saying things. But when Jesus is saying things, particularly with John, he's writing these things. He's digging down theologically, deep theologically. He's had maybe 60 years to think about all this, right? So he's absolutely knows his stuff. And he's pulling stuff from what they understood and what Jesus was pronouncing. So, he draws near to the city. Let's read it. He wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemy will set up a barricade. We read that last week, right? And he says this, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children? Now, when he's talking there, about gathering the children, he's talking about gathering the 12 tribes. All the 12 tribes are children of Jerusalem. That's because this is the city out of all the tribes which is taken to represent all the tribes. Even when the kingdom split between north, the Israel and Israel up the north, the 10 north, they got into trouble because they tried to replace Jerusalem and they tried to set up sacrificial altars. They could have easily you got to go down to Jerusalem and do your sacrifices, but we have a separate kingdom. But they violated that because they said, well, we don't want our people to go to Jerusalem, so we set something up. They set something up in Bethel and various places, and that was their problem. So go ahead.
Well, let me just add one little thing, because what you're reading here is in Matthew 23, 37 through 39. But Matthew, twice, so just so that people can understand, because again, we're talking about Israel, we're talking about the Jewish people, and many people try to make this distinction. But as he says, to gather your children. Well, in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus sends the disciples out, and he says, don't go in the way of the Gentiles, don't go the way of the Samaritans, only go to the lost house of Israel. And then in Matthew 15, to the Syrophoenician woman, who wants her daughter healed, Jesus says the same thing. I was only sent, at that point in his ministry, only to the house of Israel. And so Matthew focuses on the house of Israel, the house of Israel. It's the only place that you see that phraseology, but that you see here in Matthew 23, Jesus again saying, Jerusalem being the center point of the house of Israel, twice, I wanted to gather you together and your children, which is the house of Israel, which we've already seen in Matthew 10 and Matthew 15. So you see the centrality of Jerusalem as the point, that really the tangible central city that references all of the theology of Israel as children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and you just can't get away from that. If you remove Jerusalem, you remove the place where God. So David is the shepherd king. Right, he's and Jesus sits on the throne of the shepherd king. It's the same on the priest king, the shepherd priest king. So the shepherd is gathering, and here he uses the analogy of like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. So they understood that, because in the Old Testament, in Exodus, he said, I bore you on eagle's wings, and you gathered under the eagle's wings. So it's the same language here. He's gathering them together, but they refuse it. We discussed last week, because they had said, we have no king but Caesar. So they are renouncing. They're not just saying, oh, we prefer Caesar. They are renouncing the throne of David in the city of David. They're renouncing the witness of David, right? So there is no course of action now other than other than that which has now been decreed. And when Jesus pronounces judgment, and he pronounces judgment on the temple, and he leaves, and he doesn't go back. But it's something, something here again, so if we were to say, to express that, Jesus saying, you pledge yourself to Caesar's throne, you desire Caesar's justice, then you'll have it, and Caesar was brutal.
Mm-hmm.
He was brutal. Yeah, but that's the king they chose. And let's just talk then about this, because the interesting thing, the prophecy that Jesus said about the stones will cry out. Because again, we just think Jesus is maybe he's being cute. If he's coming into the city, what are they saying, Mondo? They're saying Hosanna to the Son of David. Yep. This is what they're declaring. They're declaring the throne of David. They're declaring the seed who's going to sit on the throne of David. He's the son of David. He's the forever seed. And then they say to him, well, tell him to shut up, basically. And Jesus says that, well, if they were silent, then the stones would cry out. Now, what's actually, what's going on there? Well, I did a little digging around. I just referenced it in the Bible here, and there's some interesting things about the stones. You mentioned about the stone, in Joshua when they crossed the river Jordan, they had to put up stones there. So stones are big in Israel, as they were in the ancient world. So this is a very prophetic moment. So here, look, Joshua 24. Let me read this. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of the God, and he took a large stone and set him up there under the terebinth that was there by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it hath heard all the words of the Lord that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. And one translation there says, lest you deny your God, which is, okay, we know where this is going, right? Habakkuk 2 says, you have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Now, this is directed at the Babylonians, but it's equally applicable to the Jews, right? So we talk about Jerusalem as the bloody city. So what's going on here? Interestingly, is that I think it's Eusebius. I think he gets it from Josephus. I can't remember. It's either one or the other. So it is there. The account was that when the army surrounded Jerusalem, AD 69, that right about that period, there were believers in the city. There were messianic believers, but they all remembered what Jesus said: when you see Jerusalem surrounded, leave. And they all left. Apparently, they all fled into the wilderness, and they sought refuge there. Well, what did Jesus say? If these are silent, then the stones will cry out. So when the last disciples of the witness of the Son of David, the witness to the throne of David, when they stopped saying Hosanna, when they left the city, well, the stones literally did cry out. There was not one stone left upon another. So, everything Jesus says has deep ramifications. He's not just being poetic when he says these things. And so the psalmist then continues, but now you have cast off, Psalm 89, and rejected. You are full of wrath against your anointed. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust, and that you have breached all his walls. You have laid his strongholds in ruins. And it's that scripture I think you've mentioned before, where it says that Jesus says, I will return to my place until you acknowledge your sin, right?
Yep, Hosea 5:15.
Yeah. So that in essence, I think, is where what we're looking at here with the witness in the sky. So let's just conclude this aspect of it, and then I'll bounce it back to you. So the Jews renounced the throne of David, the son of David. So they were given up to the throne of Caesar and the gods of Caesar, right? And Jesus now will cease to gather them, but he will now turn his attention to the Gentiles, right? So Zechariah, the shepherd is struck, the sheep are scattered. And from that, they're literally scattered all over the world for the next 2,000 years. But not before the witness returns to the skies, right? So now he returns to the sky. He's still the witness, Mondo. He's returning to the skies, but not before commissioning his own witnesses, right? This is what you will be my witnesses to fulfill Israel's call to the nations. So Jesus becomes the Israelite that they didn't become. He becomes the Jew that they were not, right? This is still Israel to the nations. This is still Israel fulfilling its mandate to the nations, except it's through the Messiah, and he is now the light. He's the light to the nation, to the nations, and you get that kind of in Romans 15. But I won't read that. So when we look at then, okay, so let's finish it with this. I'll finish it with this, and then I'll kick it back to you. Is that you mentioned John, that he has all this language? Well, about the witness. Well, when you go to the book of Revelation, right? This is what you see. This is what you read in Revelation 1:5. And so John is now seeing this eschatological unveiling of the witness. He says here, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the seven spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of kings on the earth. All of that is pulled out of Psalm 89. It's all in there. You know, this is John's understanding. And basically now, the witness returns to the skies, but the next time he comes, Mondo, he's going to roll up the skies. So, you know, that's it in a nutshell, but it's a very big nut. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I think as we think about the beauty here, that's what we really want is the Bible, as we're discussing. The goal in this series is to get a little deeper and just to interact with all of the Scripture as much as we can in a reasonable amount of time, in that all of this comes to play in understanding, and that's where I want to go now is, how do we understand, again, right now, 2023, you know, Israel's at war, its very existence is being threatened, that there is eschatological significance to that. We know that Satan hates the Jews, but it also comes back to interacting with the truth that the Jews are in the land and God had brought them back. Ezekiel 36, again, we understand the nature that the Jews that are here now, again, God said, I will bring my people back that I'm scattered through all the different nations. I will bring them back to a land that was desolate for a long time. And so we see this really beginning in the early 1900s and then finding fulfillment in 1948. So the fact of the matter is, even from 1948 on, all of the Jewish people make an aliyah from all the different countries of the world, Russia, Ethiopia. So this idea that they're not the real Jews, it just doesn't hold up for a lot of reasons, because God knows who the real Jews are, and we see all of these peoples coming from the different nations in fulfillment, clearly what the Scripture says. Now, have we seen the final or the complete fulfillment of all those passages? No. I think that there's going to be more Jews that God will bring back to the land, but the ones that are there now, they are there in unbelief. But I want us not to leave the first century for a moment, because I would like us to go to Romans chapter 11, because we do see Paul there is a Jewish person, no doubt. He's a son of Abraham going all the way back, but he is having to deal with the gospel and Jesus being a witness and the truth. And so he gets saved, as we know. Acts chapter 9 recounts that. But now Paul's had 15, 20 years to resonate and to ponder on God's covenant to the Jewish people. And he asks a question, and if people, through the book of Romans, if God is so wonderful and the gospel is so wonderful, as he does through Romans chapter 1 through 8, the question that comes up is, well, if God is so faithful in the gospel, well, what about Israel? They certainly don't seem like they're being enjoying the promises. And so he says this, and let's just kind of go through. I'll read a couple passages. Let's talk about this for a minute. Romans 11:1, I wish we could go in Romans 9 and 10, but all we have is the theology coming into chapter 11, verse 1. He says, I ask then, has God rejected his people? What people is he talking about here? He's not talking about the church. He's already talked about, he's talking about the Jewish people, because he says, well, by no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. He's talking about ethnic Israel. He's talking about national ethnic Israel. This isn't spiritual Gentiles. This isn't the church. This isn't the church becoming spiritual Israel. He's talking about ethnic Israel, the DNA. That's why Paul brings up and says, look at my DNA. I am a descendant of Abraham and of Benjamin. Verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And then he goes on and begins to discuss more and more. So let's ponder this for just a few moments. Has the distinction, here Paul's writing, again, 20 years after Jesus ascended, Paul's dealing with the question, does ethnic Israel, I mean the blood, the genetics, does it have a part to play still in Paul's theology 20 years after their rejection?
Yes, and I mean, what has been, I think, the narrative is what has been rejected is the messianic mandate to gather the tribes. That has been put on hold, as it were, because now it says, now you will be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, but go into all the world. And so when Paul writes in Hebrews, and I believe Paul wrote Hebrews, when he says, here we have no lasting city, we're being called to another mountain, we've been called to the Mount Zion, a heavenly, and he uses Abraham also as an example. He knew what was going to happen to the city. He knew it was destroyed. And so what Jesus then is doing, he's now gathering and they're all Jewish disciples, right? Mm-hmm. He's gathering Jewish disciples to himself. He's gathering Jewish witnesses to himself to witness to who was the witness. But he's still in the skies. The word hasn't been violated. The word hasn't been. It's been. And here's what we're talking about. Here's the great mystery, because Paul writes there in Romans about that all now are concluded under disobedience, so that it might be by grace. So Jew and Gentile, so that no man can boast, right? This is entirely now down to God's mercy. So, Jesus cries out that amazing prayer, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So in some ways they were culpable, but in other ways, they didn't understand, I think, the ramifications of what they were doing. But the door was still open, and we see immediately there that a few days later, a couple of months, there on the day of Pentecost, Peter said, "You killed the Messiah. You did this," and they're already doing Zechariah. They're already like beating their chest. They're already like looking on him, in whom they are pierced, and they say, "What can we do to be saved?" So that scripture is not just an eschatological end. It kicks in from the very moment. Yeah. From Pentecost, right? So that door for, so any Jew over the last 2,000 years could look upon him whom they have pierced, right? And mourn for him as an only son, because that's what they were doing. Oh my, could we have him back? No, sorry, he's now in the skies, and the heaven must receive him until the time, and the time of restoration is the time of Israel's restoration. It's not nothing has been changed. And God all knew that this was going to happen, right? He foreknew all this, but he went ahead with it anyway. You and I, we would have said, sorry, we're not doing this, but this is why we're not God, right? So he knew all of this. And so this is his mercy. And it says that it's because of his faithfulness to the patriarchs, not because of the seed is being faithful, but because the faithfulness to David, the faithfulness to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the faithfulness there, which is why they are still They are enemies of the gospel for your sakes, Paul says, but they are beloved for the election's sake. So we have to really bear that in mind. It's just, this is deep. This is calling into the deep mercy and judgment of God. It's not like our flippant theologies that we have about, oh, well, church has replaced this, and so we have to understand all of this. And just to say, we talk about anti-Semitism, if I may, is that none of what we've been talking about, Mondo, should have caused the church to go into to be anti-Semitic.
No.
It should, or Jew hatred. It should have, as Gentiles, it should have caused us, which is where we are now when we read Romans 11. It should have caused us to walk with fear and trembling. In that, if God cut off the natural vine, the natural branches, then how much more will he? He'll cut off you if you're disobedient. Do you follow what I'm saying? So Paul is pretty clear all the way through his writings. I think we confuse him because we're confused.
Yep. I think as we this whole section here, Paul is asking, has God cast off his national ethnic DNA group people? And he says no. And then, but then he brings up very clearly, which he brought up in chapter 9, he brings up the doctrine of election. And he says, he says, hey, look, and again, people can fight about election. I don't think they need to. But he's simply saying, he goes, well, haven't you read about Elijah, where Elijah whines and complains that I'm the last one left? And God says, verse 4 of Romans 11:4, I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, Paul says, at the present time, Paul's writing this, 52 AD. At the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would be no longer grace. What then? I like Paul that he does this. Again, the question for us is right now in the present era, we see that there is a nation of Israel that God has brought back that's in unbelief, but there are, from the first century, those that have rejected him. But he says, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking, but the elect obtained it. But the rest of ethnic Israel, so there is an elect within Israel, the rest were hardened, as it is written. And he goes on, but then verse 11, Paul says, so I ask, did the Jews, the ethnic Israelites, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Again, we're still not talking about spiritual Israel of anything. We're talking about ethnic national Israel. He says, now if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their inclusion mean? Now I am speaking to you Gentiles. And he goes on, and he talks about them being, some of them broken off, and we can't get into all of that. But he says in verse 23, and even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, he's talking about ethnic Israel, if they do not continue in their unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again, back again to the covenants of promise, which are there. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? But here's the key. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers, that a partial hardening has come upon Israel, ethnic, national Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. The key word here is partial, because Paul was an example of the remnant. He was not blinded, he was not hardened, but the rest of Israel was. And then, as you mentioned, verse 28, as regards to the gospel, they, ethnic Israel, those that don't believe, are enemies for your sake, but as regards to the election, they are beloved for the sake of the forefathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So as we kind of wrap up this session, what we're saying is that Jesus was a witness. He was the witness that came down from heaven in fulfillment of Psalm 89 to the promise and the throne and the covenant of David. But even though that ethnic Israel rejected that covenant, and as you said so well, John 19, we have no king but Caesar, that Jesus goes back up into the sky and he calls the apostles to be his witnesses as we are today, because there's been a partial hardening of ethnic Israel. But in the future, their restoration will bring blessings to the whole world if their stumble. I mean, that's Paul's logic. If their failure and their stumble brought blessing to the world and the Gentiles, which I'm glad that God used it, how much more their reconciliation? So kind of wrap us up here in what we've discussed today and the application that we have to what we're looking at the modern climate, the modern things that we're seeing on the ground as it relates to unbelief.
Okay, so again, I just have to separate in our minds. We're not talking about the state of Israel. We're not talking about the modern state of Israel, right? That's an entity which has happened, and that will morph into something else, right? When the Messiah returns. But it was the kingdom of Israel. It's the kingdom of the throne of David, and I think that's important to realize, Mondo, is that unfortunately we've contracted this to preaching the gospel. Right. And of course, the gospel means different things to different people, But when he told us to go into all the world and preach the gospel, there was only one thing that they had in mind, because they had asked him, is it now you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? It's not future on the times of the seasons, but to, that's in the Father's power. But now you go into all the world. He's saying, now go do something else, while the king. No, you're taking the message of the good news, the evangelion. It's the proclamation of the good news. But it's the gospel of the kingdom, of the house, and the throne, and the Son of David. That's what it is. The Son of David has come. The house of David is being established. The throne of David is being prepared. That's the gospel. So we get personal salvation, right? But it's more than personal salvation. It's more than national salvation. Right, it's cosmic salvation. Yeah, it's a recreation, and I think this is where we get into trouble, because we think, well, the gospel's come to us, I'm going to get saved, I'm going to go to heaven. But no, the gospel is this thing which all the way from Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation, which is going to include Jews and Gentiles being gathered together into this thing called the kingdom under the throne of David, because David will rule over the nations. And I think that's really important, because if you get that, then you're not going to be confused about has anybody replaced anything. It's just we're just in one chapter of this. Yeah. We're just in one chapter, and there's always been a remnant of Israel. Not all of Israel was saved. We know all the way from the Old Testament, there was always a remnant. And I think for us is that if there's if we're not preaching that gospel, then it's an uninformed gospel, or it's an ill-informed gospel. It's even a false gospel at times. If we're somehow saying that because Israel, the modern, because Jews, let's just call Jews, which Paul here calls Israel, because they're in unbelief, that they will remain that way, because there is something where God says, Jesus says, I'm no longer gathering you, the 12 tribes. I'm now going to gather the Gentiles. Until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, then I'm returning to gather the Jews. But where will he gather the Jews to? He will gather the Jews to where the Jews were meant to be gathered, which is not the nations. Nope. Which is Jerusalem. That's where, we're not really being gathered to earthly Jerusalem, but the Jews, so there's a whole lot going on here. And none of the covenants have not been abrogated. God isn't lying. He's not lied to David. So we just have to be aware. Now, listen, the land doesn't save anybody, right? So, the gospel of, whether Jew or Arab living in that land, if you're not saved, you suffer the same eternal consequences, right? So again, we don't want to be so focused on the land issue, but we have to be focused, I think, on what God is trying to do, and what He set out to do, and it's all by His grace, Mondo. It's all by His grace and by His faithfulness. Yep. And and the fact is that what you read there in Romans, it says that it's to Israel. To belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is Christ, who is God over all, blessed forevermore. Amen. So we've got to kind of just keep that picture in view, and realize that the modern, what's happening in modern Israel, or in the state of Israel, or even in a modern Jewry, I think you're right. I think more are going to be. And they don't know why they're going to go back. Nope. Maybe they feel they need to be protected. That that only Israel, the state of Israel can protect them. But in one way or another, they will be brought back. And what's bizarre to me, and we'll talk about this next time, is that people say, well, they're in disobedience, and so what? You know how long they were in disobedience before they were kicked out of the land?
Long time,
right? A long time. And what you mean? The Gentiles are not in disobedience? Look at your nation, look at my nation. It's like, so, but we're allowed to have our land, but those Jews, they're in disobedience, they can have the land, so it doesn't even make any sense, even that logic. So however God is doing this to bring them back, He's bringing them back to establish. So in other words, He's not bringing them back for them to stay in disobedience. Something has to be at the end of this. If the Jews are there for another 200 years and they're still in disobedience, then we might begin to question the scriptures, right? Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yep.
But they're being brought back so it's like a reverse process to be brought then into the full light where all Israel will be saved. And I think I'm going to finish it with this because it's just something I thought about why Satan hates the Jews. Anti-Semitism. You know why? Because a Jew has dethroned him. A Jew has dethroned Satan, a Jew has inherited a name above every other name. A Jew sits at God's right hand. And, that word in the Greek, cosmocrator, Christ cosmocrator, he's the new ruler of the heavens of the earth, a Jew. Yep. So how could we be anti-Semitic, and how could we say God is finished with the Jews? Unless God says He's finished with the Jews, we just keep our hands and say we're thankful that the gospel came to us as Gentiles because of their rejection.
Yeah, and it's a reminder to me that, again, Jeremiah 31, that if the heavens can be measured and the under earth, then God will be finished with the Jews. Romans 11, has God cast them off? I don't know how many times you can say it. And as you mentioned in Romans 9, he's talking about ethnic Israel, the covenants, the promises, and ultimately the genetic Messiah that comes there. And so, and when I look at modern Israel today and I see what's going there, it reminds me of the insufficiency or the incompleteness of the Davidic covenant that has not been established. They're there in presence. They're there in the land. They're surrounding Jerusalem. But it's another reminder that the promises that we just covered have not been done yet and will only be fulfilled when the Lord returns. But it does mean that they're there in the land, in God's land, my land. It's no accident of history that this group of people have come back to my land, having a Jewish identity, wanting to establish this state, and again, different realms of belief, as we know, read Ezekiel. But we're going to continue to see, again, that the themes that we presented today about the covenants, the people, the ethnic groups, God has them there for a reason to accomplish it for eternity, for the kingdom. And so next time, stay with us, because we want to talk about the ramifications of what happened in the first century, all throughout the last 2,000 years, and what did God do in the meantime with His land after the destruction and the rejection of the Messiah when He went up to the skies? What was the land doing? What was His people doing as He scattered them all around? So we appreciate you watching. Graham, of course, always thank you for being here. And we want to get down to the nitty-gritty of this in order to have an understanding, not only biblically, theologically, historically, of what we're seeing in the modern world today, as a reminder that God's promises will be fulfilled, but at the present time, as it relates to those grand promises, they are left unfulfilled. But it's like this stark reminder, hey, everybody, there's something more to come. So stay watching.
It's in the sky. Yes, amen. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Graham.